It started as one of those panel discussions where the topics are already decided, the audience is seated neatly in rows, and the cameras are positioned to capture every angle. The subject was political ethics, a field that invites opinion, disagreement, and, sometimes, a little grandstanding. Ivanka Trump, dressed impeccably and with her trademark composure, leaned slightly forward in her chair as the moderator turned the question to her. The question had been general, what qualities are essential for holding public office, but her answer was anything but generic. Without hesitation, she pivoted her gaze toward Jasmine Crockett, who was seated just 2 chairs away. Her tone was measured, not raised, but the words landed like a sudden drop in temperature. Frankly, I think you're unfit for the position you hold. She said it with the kind of assurance that comes from knowing every microphone is live and every camera is rolling. For a brief second, the room seemed to freeze. Not because voices were raised, but because no one expected the conversation to take such a personal turn this early in the discussion. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other as if silently asking, "Did she just say that?" The moderator looked caught between moving on quickly and probing for more. Ivanka, however, didn't wait for anyone to invite her to elaborate. She began listing traits she believed define true fitness for public office: integrity, accountability, and the ability to represent the people without personal bias. As she spoke, it became increasingly clear she was framing these traits in such a way that left no doubt she believed Jasmine fell short in each category. Her delivery wasn't theatrical. She didn't raise her voice or use inflammatory language. Instead, her tone was one of polite certainty, the kind that can sting more than outright hostility. She spoke about decision-making, how leaders should be consistent in their positions, how they should avoid contradictions between their public persona and private actions. Every example seemed to trace a faint silhouette that resembled Jasmine Crockett without Ivanka needing to say her name again. The moment was layered, part challenge, part performance, and part strategic positioning. Ivanka knew the setting: a televised discussion, a mixed audience of supporters, critics, and undecided viewers. She also knew that singling someone out in such an environment wasn't just about the words spoken in the room, it was about the clip that would be replayed online within hours. Calling someone unfit wasn't simply criticism, it was a statement meant to linger, to seed doubt, to invite others to question that person's credibility long after the lights dimmed. What made the moment more striking was the fact that Ivanka rarely used such direct language in public forums. She was known for being careful, diplomatic, even guarded when speaking about opponents. This was different. This was deliberate. It suggested that she either felt entirely confident in her position or that there was something deeper motivating her choice to say it now, in this space, in front of this audience. Jasmine's reaction, at least in that first instant, was silence. She didn't meet Ivanka's gaze immediately, didn't respond with a quick retort or a visible sign of irritation. She kept her eyes on her notes, flipping a page slowly as though she hadn't just been called unfit on live television. That contrast, Ivanka's pointed remark and Jasmine's measured stillness, only heightened the sense of anticipation in the room. People leaned in slightly, waiting for the exchange to continue, unsure whether the moment would escalate or dissolve. Ivanka, for her part, didn't backtrack or soften her statement. Once she had said it, she let it stand without qualification. She turned back to the moderator, answered the remainder of the question as if nothing unusual had occurred, and returned to her composed posture. It was the kind of confidence that said she knew exactly how her words would be interpreted and was entirely comfortable with the consequences. By the time the moderator shifted to the next question, the phrase had already done its work. Unfit had landed. It was out there, recorded, repeated, and impossible to take back. Whether viewers agreed or disagreed with her assessment, they would remember the way she said it, calmly, directly, without hesitation. In a political environment where every word is weighed, that kind of delivery can be as calculated as any campaign strategy. This was not the heated back and forth of a debate stage or the raucous exchange of a town hall. It was a statement dropped into an otherwise structured conversation, creating an undercurrent that would carry through the rest of the event. Even before Jasmine's eventual response, Ivanka had already set the tone for what was to come, one that would keep the audience, both in the room and watching from home, leaning forward in anticipation. Jasmine Crockett had been in politics long enough to know that not every moment required an immediate counterpunch. When Ivanka Trump delivered her pointed remark, calling her unfit for her role. There was a split second where every eye in the room shifted toward her, waiting to see how she would react. Many in the audience probably expected her to fire back right away, to match the directness with equal force. Instead, she stayed still, her face composed, her hands resting loosely on the table in front of her. Her decision not to react instantly was not hesitation, it was calculation. She understood that sometimes the most powerful response was not in the speed of the words, but in the precision of their timing. As Ivanka continued speaking, outlining her definition of leadership and subtly reinforcing her critique, Jasmine simply listened. Her gaze was fixed on the table, her posture unshaken. The stillness was almost deliberate, like an actor holding a pause before delivering a key line in a performance. Inside the room, the silence from Jasmine had an effect. People began to notice it, the way she wasn't rising to the bait. Panel discussions often thrive on interruptions, on rapid exchanges that keep the energy high. Here, though, she was doing the opposite, lowering the temperature while raising the suspense. The cameras, of course, caught every frame, Ivanka speaking with controlled certainty, Jasmine calmly taking it in, neither defensive nor dismissive. She didn't try to cut Ivanka off or roll her eyes. She didn't even gesture. It was as though she was allowing Ivanka all the space she needed to lay out her case, knowing that this space would also be where her own counterpoint could land with greater weight. It was a kind of political patience that comes from understanding audience psychology. By holding back, she gave the impression that she wasn't rattled, that she wasn't operating on emotion. When the moderator glanced in her direction, perhaps expecting some kind of rebuttal, Jasmine simply offered a small nod, signaling she had nothing to add at that moment. It was subtle, but it sent a message: she would choose her moment. This restraint had a ripple effect. While Ivanka's words were still hanging in the air, the lack of immediate conflict shifted the dynamic. Instead of the segment becoming a rapid-fire argument, it became a space where the audience's curiosity built in real time. There's a certain confidence required to let someone criticize you without interruption. It can be uncomfortable to watch, especially in a public setting where reputations and narratives are shaped instantly. But Jasmine understood something that wasn't immediately visible: letting someone speak without challenge also gives them room to reveal more than they might intend. In letting Ivanka continue uninterrupted, she allowed the audience to focus entirely on Ivanka's framing and tone, without the distraction of back-and-forth chatter. It wasn't passivity, it was preparation. She kept her mind on the material she had with her, the information she knew would matter more than a verbal defense. In her bag, tucked neatly between her notes, was the recording. She knew it was there, and she knew what it contained. The decision was not whether to use it, it was when. Timing, she understood, was everything. This approach also had another effect: it put Ivanka in the role of someone who had just thrown down a challenge in front of an audience that was still waiting to see the other side of the story. Jasmine's calm demeanor almost invited viewers to think, there must be more to this. That unspoken anticipation worked in her favor, because when she did choose to respond, it would be on her terms, with the full attention of the room. Even as the discussion moved on to other topics, Jasmine's composure didn't waver. She contributed to questions that were directed to her without referencing Ivanka's remark, never giving the impression that she was dwelling on it. This choice made her eventual move feel less like retaliation and more like a strategic unveiling. By not reacting instantly, she ensured that when she finally spoke directly to the accusation, her response would carry the weight of something deliberate rather than impulsive. In politics, and especially in public forums, silence can be as much a tool as speech. Jasmine's calm in the face of a public critique demonstrated that she understood how to use it. Her restraint in that moment was not weakness, it was the quiet space before a carefully planned turn in the conversation. She wasn't just responding to Ivanka, she was setting the stage for what would come next. When Jasmine Crockett finally chose her moment to respond, it wasn't with a speech, an argument, or even a pointed question, it was with a recording. The panel had moved on to a new topic, one that touched on leadership consistency and trust in public figures. The moderator's question wasn't directed specifically at her, but she used it as an opening. She reached calmly into her bag, her movements unhurried, and pulled out her phone. Her tone was even, almost conversational, as she said, "I think there's something relevant here that might add some clarity to this discussion." The room quieted as she held the phone closer to the microphone. At first, the sound was faint, just the murmurs of a private conversation. Then, unmistakably, Ivanka Trump's voice emerged, clear enough for every person in the audience and on the live stream to hear. She was speaking casually, almost warmly, to another individual, her words expressing a stance on policy and ethics that was strikingly different from what she had just stated minutes earlier on stage. In the recording, Ivanka spoke about the importance of flexibility in politics, acknowledging that sometimes personal opinions and public positions don't perfectly align, and that such shifts are necessary for navigating complex situations. She even went further, praising the kind of adaptability that, in the current discussion, she had framed as inconsistency, one of the very qualities she implied made Jasmine unfit. There was no shouting, no raised voices in the clip, but the contrast was undeniable. What she had said privately didn't align with the firm, uncompromising stance she had just taken in front of the cameras. The realization spread through the room like a quiet wave. Some leaned forward, others exchanged glances. On social media, viewers were already clipping the moment, pairing the live footage of Ivanka's panel remarks with the audio Jasmine had just played. Jasmine didn't offer commentary right away. She let the recording play to the end, even allowing a brief moment of silence afterward so the audience could process what they'd heard. Her expression remained composed, no smirk, no sign of satisfaction. When she finally spoke, it was with a measured tone. Sometimes, what we say when we think no one's listening speaks more than anything we say on this stage. By framing it that way, she avoided turning it into a personal attack. Instead, she positioned the recording as a piece of context for the audience to consider. This approach gave her more credibility. She wasn't there to humiliate, she was there to reveal. The contrast between her quiet delivery and the substance of the recording made the moment land more powerfully than if she had argued directly with Ivanka earlier. For Ivanka, the effect was immediate. She didn't interrupt or attempt to dispute the authenticity of the clip in the moment, but her expression changed subtly, just enough for viewers to notice. She maintained her posture, but her eyes shifted briefly toward the moderator, as though deciding whether to address it or let the conversation move on. The rest of the panel sat in an uneasy stillness, aware that the balance of the discussion had shifted. In the audience, reactions varied. Some supporters of Ivanka seemed unsettled, not because the recording was scandalous in itself, but because it undercut the certainty with which she had spoken earlier. Others who had been neutral saw it as a clear example of why context matters in evaluating public statements. And for Jasmine's supporters, the moment was validation, proof that she could defend herself with facts and precision rather than just rhetoric. The timing of Jasmine's move was part of its strength. By waiting until the conversation had naturally touched on themes of consistency and trust, she made the recording feel relevant rather than opportunistic. It was as though she had been waiting for exactly the right point in the dialogue to introduce it, ensuring that it would connect directly with the topic at hand. She didn't overplay her hand either. After making her brief remark, she set the phone down and allowed the discussion to continue. The absence of gloating kept the focus on the content of the recording rather than her own emotions about it. That restraint made it harder for anyone to dismiss the move as a stunt. It was simply information, presented at the moment it mattered most. In political exchanges, evidence often speaks louder than rebuttals. On that stage, in front of a live audience and countless viewers online, Jasmine's choice to let Ivanka's own words do the talking was both a tactical and symbolic victory. She didn't just counter the accusation. She reframed the entire conversation, using Ivanka's voice as the turning point. The moment the recording ended, the atmosphere in the room shifted in a way that didn't require raised voices or overt reactions. It wasn't the kind of shock that sends people gasping, it was quieter, more layered. The panelists exchanged glances, the audience leaned forward, and there was a sense that the balance of the discussion had tilted. Ivanka Trump sat with her posture intact, her expression composed, but the energy surrounding her had changed. Even without saying a word, the contrast between her earlier remarks and the content of the recording was now part of the unspoken context. The moderator hesitated before moving on, clearly aware that the tension in the room had just risen. Some members of the audience looked at Ivanka, waiting for her to address what had been played, but she chose not to take the bait immediately. Instead, she adjusted the papers in front of her, signaling a desire to stay on track with the planned questions. That decision, however, couldn't fully erase the fact that everyone was now processing two versions of her stance, one public and one private. What made the shift so significant was that Jasmine Crockett hadn't needed to raise her voice or dominate the conversation to make it happen. The power of the moment came from the way the recording aligned with the broader discussion about trust and authenticity. When someone makes a definitive claim and is then confronted with their own words suggesting the opposite, it creates a subtle but lasting change in perception. Even if the person doesn't appear flustered, the audience instinctively recalibrates how they see them. For Ivanka, the challenge was that her earlier critique of Jasmine, that she was unfit for her role, was now competing with the impression that she herself might be inconsistent. The audience wasn't being told how to interpret the discrepancy. They were left to reach their own conclusions, which can often be more impactful than being directly instructed. People tend to remember the feeling of recognizing a contradiction for themselves, and that feeling lingers longer than a scripted argument. Around the edges of the room, reactions varied. Some whispered to their neighbors, others shook their heads slightly, and a few even smirked in a way that suggested they appreciated the way Jasmine had handled the situation. For those watching online, the moment had already begun to take on a life of its own. Short clips were being posted with captions like, "The look on Ivanka's face says it all," and "When receipts speak louder than words." The narrative was spreading faster than either of them could control, but it was Jasmine's move that was defining it. The discussion on stage continued, but it no longer felt the same. When Ivanka spoke again, her words were as polished and deliberate as before, yet there was a faint undercurrent. An awareness that the audience might now be listening differently. Even points that had nothing to do with the earlier exchange seemed to carry the weight of that contrast between her public and private statements. It wasn't that her credibility had been destroyed, rather, it had been subtly but noticeably questioned in real time. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't dwell on the recording after it was played. She answered the next questions posed to her with the same calm tone she'd maintained throughout the event, never circling back to the earlier tension. That choice made the moment seem even more controlled. It was as if she had placed the evidence on the table and trusted the audience to make of it what they would. By not hammering the point, she avoided the risk of looking vindictive, keeping the focus on the substance rather than the spectacle. Over the course of the remaining panel time, it became clear that the recording had left a lasting mark. The questions from the audience in the Q&A segment subtly reflected it. Several touched on the importance of transparency and the consistency between a leader's public and private positions. The theme had embedded itself into the conversation, even if it wasn't explicitly named. By the time the session concluded, the panelists exchanged polite farewells, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Ivanka had made a calculated statement early on, one designed to define Jasmine in the minds of the audience. Jasmine's choice to respond not with argument but with evidence had not only neutralized the criticism but also shifted the focus entirely. It was the kind of exchange that wouldn't just end with the event, it would continue in discussions, in news coverage, and in the countless online debates sparked by that short but potent clip. As the panel drew to a close, the formalities of polite smiles and handshakes couldn't fully mask the undercurrent left by what had unfolded. The moderator offered a quick wrap-up, thanking the participants for their time and insight, but the audience's attention was still tethered to the earlier exchange between Ivanka Trump and Jasmine Crockett. The discussion had covered policy, leadership values, and the responsibilities of public office, yet the defining moment was something far simpler, one person's accusation, and another's decision to respond with proof rather than defense. In political settings, especially those televised and instantly dissected online, the lasting impression often isn't the full breadth of conversation, it's the one moment that crystallizes everything for viewers. Here, that moment was Jasmine quietly playing a recording that undercut Ivanka's earlier position. No matter how the rest of the event unfolded, that contrast between words spoken on stage and words spoken in private had become the lens through which people would recall the entire discussion. For Ivanka, the challenge was not just the discrepancy itself, but the way it was revealed. She had entered the panel with confidence, delivering her points with her usual polished composure. Calling Jasmine unfit was a deliberate move, one intended to set the tone and perhaps put her on the defensive. But Jasmine's decision to remain calm, to let the event continue until she could respond on her own terms, changed the rhythm entirely. By the time the recording played, the room was already primed to listen closely, and the impact was magnified. Jasmine's restraint was as much a part of the story as the recording itself. She didn't turn the moment into a confrontation, she didn't gloat or linger on it. She allowed the content to speak for itself, knowing that the audience, and by extension, the public, would form their own conclusions. This left her appearing measured and strategic, qualities that directly countered the unfit label she had been given earlier. The audience's reaction was telling. There were no loud interruptions or outbursts, but there was a collective shift in focus. What had begun as a straightforward discussion about leadership values had evolved into a real-time demonstration of them. Viewers weren't just hearing theories about accountability and consistency, they were watching those ideas tested in the moment. By the end, both Ivanka and Jasmine maintained their outward professionalism, but the narrative had moved beyond the stage. Clips were already circulating, headlines were being drafted, and the broader conversation was forming around that single exchange. It was a reminder of how quickly public perception can turn, not through dramatic clashes, but through quiet moments where facts are laid bare. In the hours and days that would follow, the discussion would continue on television, online, and in countless private conversations. Some would defend Ivanka, framing the recording as harmless context taken out of proportion. Others would see it as a rare glimpse into the gap between polished statements and candid truth. But regardless of where people landed, they would remember the moment Jasmine chose silence, waited, and then let the evidence speak. That was the point where the conversation, and perhaps the perception of the people involved, changed.